A Nazi general. In American custody. Looked General Georges Patton dead in the eye, and insulted the United States Army to his face. And Patton didn't shoot him. What happened in that room is one of the most remarkable, strangest, and least told stories of the entire Second World War. And by the end of this video you'll understand why it was buried for decades. It's May 1945. The war in Europe is over, at least on paper. The guns have gone quiet. The Nazi war machine has been crushed. But in a small Bavarian town, a confrontation is about to take place that will challenge everything you think you know about how World War II actually ended. A captured German general. America's most feared and famous warrior. And a conversation so explosive that the people in that room couldn't believe what they were hearing. The German didn't beg. He didn't grovel. He didn't thank the Americans for not shooting him on sight. He lectured them. If you're enjoying this story already, make sure you subscribe, because the ending of this video reveals something that most history books barely mention, and it changes how you see the entire final chapter of the war. So who was this man? And what on earth gave him the nerve to stand in front of George Patton, the man who had torn through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany like a hurricane, and tell him that America was doing it all wrong? To understand that, we need to go back. Not to the beginning of the war, but to its very last days. Because that's when the strange part starts. By April 1945, the Third Reich was dying. Hitler was underground in his Berlin bunker, raving at maps, moving phantom armies that no longer existed. The SS was executing German soldiers for desertion. Entire Wehrmacht divisions were surrendering not because they were beaten in battle, but because their men were walking off into the woods and refusing to fight anymore. The American army was advancing so fast it was outrunning its own supply lines. And in this chaos, one German general made a decision that would define the rest of his life, and set the stage for the most audacious act of defiance any captured enemy officer would ever commit on American soil. His name was Hermann Balck. Write that name down because you need to remember it. Balck was not some desk general. He was not a Nazi party creature who had gotten his rank through political connections. He was considered by many military historians, including some Americans, to be one of the finest tactical commanders of the entire war. The Germans called his kind a Panzerführer, a master of armored warfare. He had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, in France, in the Balkans. He had won the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor, with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. Only 27 men in the entire German military received that distinction across the whole war. And what most people don't know is that American military analysts had already been studying Balck before they ever captured him. Not to prosecute him. To learn from him. That detail alone should tell you something strange was happening. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. When Balck surrendered to American forces, he wasn't shaking. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was calm. Almost eerily so. Like a man who had already decided something. Like a man with a plan. And that plan was about to collide with the most volatile, unpredictable general in the United States Army. Now you already know who George Patton was. Or you think you do. The pearl-handled revolvers. The slapping incident. The speeches. The image of a warrior so aggressive, so personally invested in combat, that the Germans reportedly transferred entire divisions just to get them away from his sector of the front. But there's a side of Patton that most people never discuss. Patton was obsessed with military history. Not just American military history. All military history. He believed he had lived past lives as a warrior, as a Roman legionnaire, as a soldier under Napoleon, as a Greek warrior at Troy. He studied his enemies with an almost academic intensity. He wanted to understand how great commanders thought, how they moved, how they won. And so when word reached Patton that Hermann Balck had been captured, one of Germany's most gifted operational commanders, Patton did something almost no one expected. He asked to meet him. Not to interrogate him. Not to humiliate him. To talk. And that is where things took a completely unexpected turn. The meeting was arranged. The details of exactly where it happened have been disputed over the years. Some accounts place it in a farmhouse in Bavaria, others in a more formal military setting. But what happened inside that room? That part is documented. Balck walked in. And from the very first moment he did not behave like a prisoner. He stood straight. He made eye contact. And according to accounts from people who were present or who later interviewed participants, he spoke to Patton not as a defeated enemy, but as a professional equal. Now, Patton could have ended the conversation right there. He could have had Balck thrown in a cell and never spoken to him again. He didn't. Because Patton recognized something in Balck that very few other Americans would have. He recognized a soldier. A real one. And that mutual recognition, between two men who had dedicated their entire lives to the art of war, created a conversation unlike anything else in the historical record of that period. But what came next was what no one in that room could have prepared for. Balck started talking about the war. Not to confess. Not to apologize. To analyze. He walked through campaign after campaign with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster reviewing a game. He talked about what the Germans had done right. He talked about what they had done wrong. He talked about the Soviets, in vivid, terrifying detail. He had fought them longer and harder than almost any other German general still alive. And then, and this is the part that stunned everyone in the room, he turned his analysis on the Americans. He told Patton that the U.S. Army, for all its industrial might and all its brave soldiers, had made serious tactical mistakes throughout the campaign in Western Europe. He pointed to specific battles. Specific decisions. He was not vague or diplomatic. He was surgical. And then he said something that, depending on which account you read, either made Patton's jaw tighten with fury or made him lean forward with intense interest. Balck told the Americans that they didn't understand the Soviets. That they were about to make a catastrophic strategic error. That the real war, the war that would matter for the next 50 years, wasn't the one that had just ended. It was the one that was about to begin. In May 1945, with the ink on the German surrender barely dry, Hermann Balck sat across from George Patton and told him that America was already losing the next war. And the truth was even stranger than it sounds, because Patton agreed with him. Let that sink in for a moment. The victorious American general and the defeated German commander found themselves in complete agreement about the most dangerous geopolitical threat on the planet. The Soviet Union. Patton had been saying it for months. Quietly at first, then more and more loudly to the growing alarm of his superiors. He believed that the Allied armies should not stop at the Elbe River. He believed they should push east. He believed the window to confront Soviet expansion in Europe was closing fast, and once it closed, it might not open again for generations. His commanders told him to be quiet. Eisenhower told him to be quiet. Washington told him to be quiet. And here, in whatever room this meeting took place in, was a German general saying the exact same thing, but with far more personal knowledge of what the Soviets were actually capable of on the battlefield. Balck had seen things on the Eastern Front that Western commanders could barely imagine. He had watched Soviet commanders absorb losses that would have shattered any Western army and keep coming. He had seen their logistical capacity grow year after year. He had watched their tactics evolve from clumsy and rigid in 1941 to frighteningly sophisticated by 1944. He told the Americans they did not respect their new adversary. And if they didn't start learning, fast, the consequences would be severe. Now, here's what most people don't know about this exchange. This was not just an informal conversation between two warriors who happened to find each other interesting. What Balck was describing, the threat posed by the Soviet Union, the tactical and operational lessons of the Eastern Front, was exactly the kind of intelligence that the United States desperately needed. And someone in Washington knew it. What most people don't realize is that Hermann Balck was not the only German general being debriefed in this way. In the final months of the war and the months that followed, the U.S. Army began a systematic program of interviewing captured German commanders, not just to gather war crimes evidence, but to extract military knowledge. The program would eventually be called the German Report Series. Hundreds of after-action reports, tactical analyses and operational studies, written by German generals for the U.S. Army. Balck would become one of its most important contributors. But that's not the twist. That's just context. The real twist, the thing that history books gloss over, that documentaries skip past, that most people who know this story have never fully confronted, is what this entire episode reveals about how World War II actually ended and what came immediately after. Because the same men who had been trying to kill American soldiers 6 months earlier were now sitting across tables from American officers, sharing everything they knew about how to fight the Soviets. Former enemies. Instant partners. And nobody was asking too many questions about what those German generals had done on their way to this moment. Balck himself was not without controversy. Far from it. He had commanded forces on the Eastern Front during some of the most brutal periods of that conflict. The Eastern Front was not like the Western Front. The Geneva Convention was largely ignored. Atrocities were committed on a scale that remains almost incomprehensible. Partisan reprisals, the treatment of Soviet prisoners, the behavior of German forces in occupied Soviet territory, these were crimes and they happened under the command of men like Balck. Balck was later tried by a West German court, not by the Americans, not by the Nuremberg Tribunal, but by a West German court in 1953. He was convicted of ordering the execution of an artillery officer and sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years. For a man who had commanded forces during some of the most horrific campaigns in military history. That sentence tells you everything about the world that existed in 1953. The Cold War was already well underway. Germany was being rearmed. Former Wehrmacht officers were being reintegrated into the new West German military, the Bundeswehr. And the Americans needed every piece of Soviet-related intelligence they could get their hands on. The knowledge these men carried in their heads was worth more than the justice that might have been served by keeping them in prison. That was the calculation. Whether it was the right calculation, that's a question historians are still arguing about. But here's the part of the story that brings everything back to that room in Bavaria. Back to Balck and Patton. Back to that extraordinary meeting between a defeated German general and America's most famous warrior. Patton never got to act on any of it. By December 1945, George Patton was dead. A car accident in Mannheim, Germany. His car was struck by a U.S. Army truck. He died 12 days later from his injuries, on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. He never got to fight the war he believed was coming. He never got to put into practice the lessons he had absorbed from men like Balck. The voice that had been loudest in warning about the Soviet threat, the voice that had most aggressively pushed for a more confrontational posture while the Western armies were still in position to enforce one, was silenced within months of the war ending. And Hermann Balck? He lived until 1982. He was 88 years old when he died. He spent decades after the war writing, giving interviews, working with military historians. He cooperated extensively with American researchers studying the operational lessons of the Eastern Front. His memoirs, published in German and later in English, are still studied today in military colleges. He outlived Patton by nearly 4 decades. The man who had been captured and who had sat across from America's greatest general and told him, to his face, that America was making a mistake, lived long enough to see whether he had been right. And what most people don't want to say out loud, but military historians quietly acknowledge, is that on the core strategic question. On the question of Soviet ambition, Soviet capability, and the looming confrontation that would define the second half of the 20th century, Balck and Patton were not wrong. The Cold War lasted 45 years. Korea, Vietnam, the nuclear arms race, the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall. Everything that Balck had gestured toward in that conversation, the scale of the threat, the nature of the adversary, the cost of underestimating them, played out on the world stage for the next half-century. So what do we make of all this? Here is a man who fought for one of the most evil regimes in human history.